Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I'm your host, Will Reusch. Before I get into the topic for today, I do want to address the elephant in the room that we are under a quarantine right now, and COVID-19 is on the forefront of everyone's minds. And I'm still going to push forward with this podcast because the point of this podcast, the reason I started it was to try and highlight other perspectives and get a deeper understanding for people that think differently than you. And Jonathan Haidt recently tweeted about how polarized and politicized everything has gotten with this. And it's understandable because it's aggravating what's happening in Congress. Our president is aggravating in a lot of ways. But he brought up that 9/11, which is not that long ago, less than 20 years ago, did not have this kind of polarization. And maybe it would today. Maybe there'd be a louder voice than just the fringe of, well, we deserve this, or it's because of X, Y, and Z. And I think it's really important to pull away from that polarization, try and get a deeper understanding of the nuance that goes on with really complex and difficult concepts. So in that vein, today we're going to talk about American history. And my guest is someone that I know personally and I respect deeply. And it's Dr. Keith Harris, who is a historian, specifically in early American history. Dr. Harris, Keith, thank you for coming on the show. Can you give us a little bit of a background just before we get into U.S. history about why you would be someone who would have an expertise in this area, a little bit of your background, introduce yourself to the audience?
Hey, man. Hey, Will. And first of all, thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. I think this is a great thing that you do, and I'm happy to be here. So my background in American history is I guess officially, I'm a 19th century Americanist with a focus on Civil War and Reconstruction. And I have spent a good deal of my career sort of looking at how the Civil War continues to resonate in a modern context, in a 21st century context. One of the sort of the niche field that I'm in is called historical memory. And so I deal a lot with that kind of thing. And so when issues come up like, Confederate flag controversies, monument controversies, various other things about neo-Confederates and their connections to white supremacy and their claims of Confederate heritage and various other things like that, I feel that my background in Civil War history going forward is with my works on veterans and how they articulated their contributions to the Civil War and their causes. I think I've got a pretty solid background on that kind of stuff, and I feel that I can speak about it with some level of expertise. But that's it. I have a pretty decent working knowledge of the rest of the stuff too. Yeah. But that kind of stuff comes up, in the 20th century civil rights movement, for example. During Reconstruction, of course, in the New South and the Progressive era, all these things kind of got Jim Crow segregation. It's very important to understand that when you understand this kind of Civil War memory and various other things. So, yeah, I think I can. I'm good.
Absolutely. And I think that especially like in that area, your specific area, I think it's going to translate well to what I'm trying to get at here. When I had James Lindsay on the program, talking about education and social justice and where that's going with the social justice movements and stuff in education is he advocated that he suggested I get a historian on, and immediately I thought of you, and it's just been a couple of months since we were able to sit down and do it. But something that gets brought up a lot, and this is happening with everything right now, is people who are not economists and not epidemiologists they know exactly what we should be doing during this time. But I see this a lot in history too, is people are saying things about what American history is. They're like, oh, I know our history, but no, not it's quite complicated. You've invested a lot of time in understanding the nuance of this. Not everyone is a historian and understands the complex nature of everything. Do you find yourself sometimes getting a little frustrated, or do you see that as well, where people say like, oh, I understand history, when they really don't, in any kind of context?
To say a little frustrated is definitely an understatement. I get frustrated pretty much on a daily basis these days. I'm addicted to Twitter, which is probably a bad idea, but I spend a lot of time on Twitter, just sort of reading through some of the takes. And what tends to happen is it's usually somewhere along, and there are a lot of historians on Twitter, by the way, who will, roll out these threads that really explain things in detail. And so I really applaud the efforts of some of the historians who take the time to do that on Twitter and provide correctives for some of the things that I'm about to describe to you now. I see a lot of people who have something like heavily invested in their political party, heavily invested in their identity, whatever that might be, heavily invested in their personal political agenda, whatever that might be, will very selectively pick something from history and use it to support that, to support their agenda. And that kind of thing I find to be dangerous, because it erases the sweep of history and the complexity of history. And you're right. I have spent, the last 40 years of my life really kind of reading history seriously since I was a teenager, and then studying it in college, and now doing it as my profession. And, I have to say, you can't just go and pick one thing out of history and use it to support something, or even just a few things, because it leaves out all the other stuff. And all this stuff is wound together. And I'll dismiss all the academic jargon. I don't have any interest in going into that kind of stuff. But for your lay reader of history, of which there are many who are well informed, I think they're getting frustrated too. And I engage with these kind of folks all the time, and I see it's like, a politician, for example, and politicians are great at doing this. Will pick something and say, in 1935 this happened, and therefore, this party is now terrible. That's a ridiculous thing to say, and it doesn't really look at change over time, which is what historians really try to understand, is how things change over time. It doesn't address how people's perspectives evolve over time, how political parties evolve over time, how ideologies evolve over time. I mean, all of these things are constantly in a state of flux. So to cherry pick, events in history and then use that to support things that are happening in the 21st century, your own takes on things that are happening in the 21st century, is just dangerous, I think, and it does far more harm than good, I believe.
Do you like personally feel like, as a historian, that you have to just be very aware of your own personal biases? Because the reason I ask this is, one of the things also that Jonathan has brought up is, like, for the peer review system, that if you have inherent biases, that you are going to scrutinize data very differently, because you just see the world through specific lenses. We all do. So if you were abused as a kid, or you have certain experience, then you're going to see a certain action is different than someone who wasn't. And one of the things he brings up is, like, if a study comes out that says caffeine causes breast cancer, then men who don't drink coffee will be like, yeah, data seems accurate. But women who drink coffee will go, wait a second, let me look at this, because it affects them directly. So when you analyze historical, like primary sources and stuff, do you have to recognize that you are going to have your inherent biases, and you are always fighting against those?
Yeah, I always do that.
You do.
And thanks for bringing that up, because it's something that I sort of pride myself on doing. It's something with my own students, I try to teach them that when we look at any document, any document from the past, we have to remember that we're bringing certain things to the table with us whenever we read those documents. And that could be a number of things. And it could be race, it could be ethnicity, it could be gender, it could be age, it could be socioeconomic background, it could be where you are in the world, it could be how you were brought up, whether you had strict parents or lenient parents. It could be any number of things. And so if I'm reading a document, I can't help but read it through the lens of my personal experiences. So what I need to do, and this is challenging, by the way, this isn't something that's I'm saying is particularly easy, but try to distance yourself from those biases as much as you possibly can, being aware of them, that they exist, and try to understand the document or the set of documents or whatever it may be through the lens of the person who wrote it to the best of your ability. So you have to try to understand their context as well, which is why when I teach my kids, and this makes people uncomfortable, but I think you need to make people uncomfortable to understand why things happen the way they did. When I give my kids, writings from slaveholders justifying their position as slaveholders, or trying to define slavery, for example, as a positive good. And everybody, of course, and they should do this, everybody recoils, you know, they go, oh my God, how can people say that slavery was good? That's absolutely absurd. And they go, okay, fine, yes, I agree with you. Here we are sitting in the 21st century where, of course, we all believe that slavery is a horrible thing, but try to look at it from their perspective. Look at how they view the world, their view world, and try to see if you can understand why they might think that. Don't have to agree with them, but we can try to understand why we might think that. And so that's sort of you have to separate sometimes, well, all the time, you have to separate yourself from the documents to the best of your ability. And that's, you can never be fully objective. I don't believe you can ever be fully objective, but you can do your best to try and be objective as possible.
Yeah, I think that should be definitely an aim of history teachers out there, is exactly what you're doing. The third rail when it comes to teaching American history, though, it is trying to understand the evils, because in understanding that getting into that headspace is a very scary place to go. Like, to really understand, like, how could I be a slave owner and whip people and rape people? How could I be a Nazi? And this is like really dark stuff that we choose not to go to, because why would you ever want to go to that horrific place in your head? But if you don't go there in some degree, you won't understand it. And if you don't understand it, then you might not be able to prevent similar things from happening in the future. But I think a lot of historians, history teachers, because we're both, educators, like, I think they don't want to go near that, or even challenging the status quo of just slavery is wrong. That's all that there is to it. Yeah, but that's not all there is to it. Yes, it's wrong. Things can be wrong, but we need to dive into how this happened and what were the legitimate justifications at the time for it, not just holding them to the 2020 standard of what we're kind of doing.
Yeah, and listen, I think it's tempting to want to, to lay our veneer over everything, and but where does that really get us? How do we understand history like that? And then if we're doing that, then we're really just sort of projecting our own personal agendas onto students. I don't know if I'm necessarily comfortable doing that, and I will tell my kids if they ask me, what my positions are on things. But I always just try to let them, work through some of these ideas on their own and give them the dark places. They need to understand that stuff. Whitewashing history is a terrible, terrible idea, because I you try to look, how could somebody become a Nazi? How could somebody, want to be a slaveholder? This is the kind of things you have to address. If you really want to understand how things change, if you really want to understand how things happen the way they happened, you have to touch on these dark places in history.
Yeah, the one of the issues that's been brought up, and I see it a lot in, among a lot of educators and people who are on both sides of politics, one for positive, one for negative, is the New York Times 1619 project. I know you and I privately have talked about it. This is the Nicole Hannah-Jones kind of spearheaded idea that America wasn't founded in 1776. It was founded with the start of the first slaves coming over from Africa. And what this kind of goes to is this all-encompassing idea that I'm going to go into. We're going to touch on this third rail, Keith, because I think it's important to talk about. And I know you personally, and I know, that you're a good person, and I know that you have good intentions. Same, hopefully my audience knows that about me. So we can go into this stuff and not and challenge it, because I think people are scared that if they challenge some of these ideas, that they will be labeled as a racist, sexist, homophobic, whatever it is. And the fear of being labeled that way prevents us from going through these very important intellectual exercises. So the general concept that America is fundamentally a racist, sexist, tyrannical patriarchy founded on genocide. That is something that is common language now about America. This concept that, like the crazy MAGA hats and stuff like that is like, when was America ever great? America was never great and is not great, is, I think, very overly simplistic. And I just want to get your thoughts on the people out there who kind of promote that language. Like, what is true about that, and what is, by your estimation, untrue or not not a very, it's like almost like pixelated. Like it's not a better, it's not clearly clear resolution, I guess, understanding of history. Just when you hear that kind of language, what are your
Yeah, when I
thoughts
hear
on that?
that, and thanks for bringing it up, really. And first of all, let me just say that I think you're right to suggest that we need to be honest about these conversations, right? And when you have these kind of conversations, I mean, here we are, just having, shooting the breeze, a couple of white dudes hanging out talking about racism, right? So what does that mean? Does that mean that we can't possibly understand it? To a degree, yeah. I don't think we can possibly understand it because neither of us have ever had to experience that on a personal level, okay? So there's that. And I still think that even though that's the case, we need to have good faith conversations about these things without trying to promote one thing one way or another, and just really kind of like looking at the evidence, right? What evidence do we have? What assertions are these folks making? And does the evidence, does it hold up to the evidence? Okay, and as a historian, I've dedicated my life to looking at evidence. Okay, so first of all, for the folks that say that the United States is a nation that's founded on racist principles, and it is founded on genocidal principles, and it has been that way ever since, and has never changed, and doesn't seem to be changing anytime in the foreseeable future. I mean, that is an overly simplistic look at things, I think, and I believe that it's ahistorical to a degree, but I hear them. Okay, so I really hear that what is going on there, and I want to have those conversations with folks who look at history as that way, because the truth is over the course of the last several hundred years, there have been episodes the narrative is filled with incidents of horrendous discrimination against people and marginalization against groups of people based on whatever that might be, their race, their ethnicity, their gender, their sexual orientation, whatever it may be. Folks have been marginalized and folks have been killed for this. And there's no denying that that's absolutely the truth. And it is really a stain on the fabric of the United States without question. Okay, without question. And that can be demonstrated easily in a million different ways. Okay, so I recognize that and I acknowledge that. I also acknowledge that things are, there's some people in some pretty sticky spots right now. And you can connect that to the legacy of some of the things that we've dealt with, like slavery and like Jim Crow segregation. Folks that don't have access, Black folks, for example, that don't have the same access to resources that I might have because of their historical circumstances. And so I also acknowledge that. And I know that that's still a problem. Now, let me say, but here's where the big but comes in. And this is where, some people will probably disagree with me. And I welcome that disagreement so we can have a real honest conversation about it. The way I see the origins of the United States, first of all, with slavery, I see it as an evolving institution that got its start in 1619 with absolutely true with the importation, I believe is the exact, and somebody will call me on this because it's probably not exactly right, so I'll just say I'm paraphrasing, but 20 or some Negroes were delivered into British Virginia, and there begins the history of slavery right there. But it's an institution that evolved over time, and over the course of several decades became much more firmly entrenched, where the status of people was in question, and they recognized their differences and various other things, but the status, the future, all of these different things were in question. And it wasn't really until much later than the institution, the chattel slavery institution that we recognize, say like in the 1850s, really gets firmly established, I think. Now, this is me based on the evidence, the evidence that I've looked at and the changing nature of things. Ira Berlin, for example, the great historian who recently passed away, wrote about this in great detail, and at the University of Maryland, where he worked with historian Barbara Fields from Columbia University, and they did some work together on the freedom documentaries and various other things, just showing the changing nature of stuff, slavery, how it's an evolving institution and how things change. And so, to me, that is something that we need to contend with, but you really need to, if you're looking at the what is the country founded on? Is it founded on that by itself? I would have to disagree. And I would have to say that, no, I don't think it's founded on those principles. In my estimation, it's founded on Enlightenment principles, but founded by people who are racists, okay? So what we have in the end is ideals that are unrealized. Okay, so these are the ideals that are put in place at the founding of the nation that the civil rights leaders will look back on, in the 20th century and say, we are simply trying to achieve these ideals set forth by the founders of the country, who didn't practice the very ideals that they said that they honored, they cherished. And so we see the contradiction, right? When we get to the 1619 Project, I believe that Nicole Hannah-Jones was right to reveal that contradiction. Although I don't think she's particularly novel in revealing the contradiction. I mean, this is something that I've been talking about, and every historian that I know has been fully aware. I mean, I learned about this stuff in the 8th grade, that there was contradictions inherent in the founding of the country. But I do applaud the effort of the 1619 Project by reframing history from the perspective of the Black experience. That, I think, is very valuable, right? So there are things in it that I would criticize. And we can talk about the details of the things that I would criticize if you want, but there are things in it that I would criticize. Overall, I think there's value in the conversation. And so, like, many critics have just completely dismissed it. I think that that's probably the wrong thing to do. Completely dismissing a project. I mean, this is a monumental task, a monumental feat that was put together by the New York Times. I guess last August it came out, right? Or last September, I can't remember.
Yeah, it was like last summer.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So this came out, and what happened was, and this is where I think the real value lays. Even though I'm critical of it in some ways, the value is that it came out and it created a discussion. And here we are almost a year after it came out, still talking about it. That means that she and all the contributors to the project have done something right. They may have some things wrong, right? Or not quite right. I'd probably rather frame it like that. But overall, it's an exercise in public history that I think is so incredibly valuable. Only if you actually do your due diligence and look into if you've got an opinion and your opinion is based on something that your grandfather told you when you were a kid, and you read this and go, this is complete BS, this is garbage, and you throw it out the window, well, then okay, good for you. You haven't really accomplished anything. Yeah. If you stop and go, which is exactly what I did, by the way. I'm not an expert in the history of the early republic. And so when this stuff came out, I said, okay, I'm going to go, read up on this. And I go, some of the evidence isn't really holding water to me. But look at what she's done, right? She sent me to the archive. She sent me to the library. She sent millions of other people too. So that, I think, is extraordinarily valuable.
Yeah, I mean, that's like a John Stuart Mill thing, right? Where he was basically like, if you have an idea, even if it's wrong, that it could help get you to the right idea.
Sure.
Very similar. Yeah. Like maybe it's like Howard Zinn. Like Howard Zinn's a very controversial figure, but I've used Howard Zinn in my high school classroom, but I know a lot of schools use it as the primary text. And I want to get your thoughts on Zinn, because he's controversial. And, I think that it's similar in that, when I first was introduced to people's history of the United States, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the truth. Everything I heard was a lie. This is the actual truth. Where the way I am now, and I'm curious to your thoughts on this, but where I am now is like, well, it's not, it's yes and. This is a perspective. And, it's like the Rashomon effect. Like if you see a car accident and there's 25 people are going to see 25 different things. So telling history from the point of view of the oppressed is one of the many. And to use Howard Zinn as supplemental resources has real benefit, as does the 1619 Project. But to use that and then try to show where it's lacking is a real positive activity. But to use that as the only text would be very lacking, and it would actually get back to why the 1619 Project or people's history, there was a market for that in the first place. Was like, hey, what about the other perspectives? So to get all of those points of view is kind of the way that I see Howard Zinn's work. But I'm curious, I know you and I have talked about this a little bit in private, but just curious if you could share your thoughts on Zinn. And
sure.
He's the most famous historian in the world, right?
Yeah, if there can be such a thing as a famous historian. I mean, now we have social media, I think some of us are getting a little bit more traction. There's a few historians out there that are actually getting some traction, but Zinn is a fascinating character, and he's another one of these guys that I really appreciate that book exists. Because it came out at a time where the historiographical trends at the time were very celebratory of America as a national experiment. It was the kind of thing that you can see the tradition that came out of like the post World War II generation, and some of the books that were written there that were very celebratory. And Zinn challenged that, and he challenged it in a way that I think blew a lot of people away. I mean, you said yourself when you first read it, you were like, "Whoa, this is the truth," right? Because here is a history that no one had ever heard. I mean, we know the history of the founding generation. We know the history of the struggles of the Union, and we know the history of the industrial giant that the United States became that could defeat fascism, and that's a great story. I love that story. But then but what's not included in that is the struggles of the Pullman strike of the late 19th century, or the grassroots voting rights campaigns in Mississippi in 1950s, and these real like social struggles that we hadn't really thought all that much about. And he goes, I mean, he's very extreme in his take on this stuff. And to his credit, in his introduction, he says flat out, I have an agenda, and here's my agenda, and here's what I'm going to write about because you haven't heard about it yet. Now I'm going to tell you. So I give him credit for that. So I think, like you do, that this is that we should introduce that to students when we're talking about historiography. We should introduce Zinn to students, explain to students who Zinn is, what he was arguing against, and where he kind of fits in the grand scheme of things. To use Zinn as the fundamental text, and it's not only a book. There's an entire I forget what it's called. Howard Zinn website that you can go to for lesson plans and various other
full
things.
Curriculum for the whole year.
The whole thing, right? And so that to me smacks of just like a very one-sided way of looking at history. And again, just like the 1619 Project, I think there's value to looking at Zinn. He's an important guy, but to assign it as the sole text, I mean, you're really getting a very narrow slice of history of the United States, and you're getting one person's very biased opinion. I like my students to know who he is, and I'll assign some readings from him so they get it. But I assign readings from all kinds of people from the far left. I just recently had my kids read, Eugene Debs' speeches, the socialist from 1912, and they're like, "Whoa, this sounds really familiar to us. What, free college for everybody?" Right? And they go, "Ah, okay." But then I'll have them. I go, "There's something that's important you should know about American history." Then I'll have them read stuff from the Conservative Coalition, who argued against FDR in the 1930s, and they'll go, "Oh my God, this stuff sounds really familiar. He's overstepping his, So I like to give people all kinds of different perspectives, and I think it's important that they get it. And it gives them the tools to make decisions for themselves. It's what critical thinking is all about.
Yeah, and again, that's also another reason why I wanted to have this conversation in a public forum is, back to the cylinder radio is, just the America can do no wrong, it would be the square or the rectangle. And then the just America is, never been great in this, place founded on genocide is just the circle. And it's like, well, no, it's more complex than that. The idea that we were founded in these horrible racist genocidal principles, it's like, or America was never great. It's like, yeah, we have a checkered past, but what nation hasn't? I mean, what nation can you point to and say like they did everything right throughout history? Like, I mean, you can't, I get like dumping on America for pointing out like its flaws, but still, like what I've noticed just from having, I've had Zuby on this podcast, who's a public figure, but a black guy born in the UK, raised in Saudi Arabia, and went to Oxford, smart guy and like just world thinker. But he's traveled the world, so he sees America a certain way. I have friends in the military. I have family from the Philippines. They see America very differently because they have seen what is out there, and they go, "Oh my God, there are real horrors still." Go to Saudi Arabia or something like that and wear a miniskirt. Like to say that America is this horrible place is just, it's not, it's just, I don't think it's fair. I think we're flawed and we want to get better and we should get better, but it's dishonest to say that we are just solely bad. And I think it's really important that we recognize. I had Kyle Carter on the podcast, and he is an activist, and he agrees. He loves America and he's very critical of it. And it's kind of like your best friend. Like your best friend is not the one who says like, you're always great, you can do no wrong. right? Your best friend says like, man, you're really acting like an a-hole right now. Like that's what your best friend does, calls you out. And I think that's a really important part of being a historian. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do agree with that actually, and this is an unpopular take sometimes as well, especially in my world and in some academic circles.
Mm-hmm.
It can be unpopular anyway. But on my Twitter feed and in my profile description, it says it's okay to be, and there's a little American flag icon. It's okay to be USA. It's fine. Listen, I come from. I mean, I was just reading the census, looking over the census from 1940 the other day, and I was just awestruck at what I've accomplished in my life and where I've come from. My grandfather was worked as a common laborer for U.S. Steel and had an 8th grade education. His father was a dirt farmer, tenant farmer in northern Alabama, who didn't have a pot to piss in, right? Nothing at all. And in just a couple of generations, I'm doing all right, right?
Yeah,
but okay, on the other hand, before everybody jumps down my throat and rips me a new one, on the other hand, yeah, I get it. I've had some advantages in the world, right? I've had some advantages that other people haven't had. And so, and so I understand that, like you said, this country is flawed, but I also understand that, in comparative terms, there are a lot more opportunities here for people than there are elsewhere in the world. And that while I acknowledge that can be absolutely a challenge for some folks, and unfairly so, it's a work in progress, and I do believe that, and I hate to be Whiggish about this and say we're heading for a utopia and everything's going to be fine, guys. Don't worry, just wait 3 or 4 more generations.
Right.
I don't want to say that either, because history kind of ebbs and flows, but the potential exists anyway, right? The potential set up by the framers exists, and so if we take this seriously, maybe we can get closer to realizing what those things were, and maybe not. Maybe we'll screw ourselves. Who knows? Where we can be very hateful toward each other, and it's happened before where we've started killing each other in great numbers. Yeah. So hopefully it won't happen again.
Yeah, I think that anyone listening, is there a time, especially if you're a member of a marginalized group, is there a time you'd rather be living? Is there a place that you'd rather be living? Like, but those things can hold the same space. Like, it's not ideal for me or my people or however I identify, and it's still better than it has been. So yeah, I think that's like a more fair way, and it balances conservatism and liberalism and all those different ideas. I know it's not in particular like you're like particularly feel, but I still think that you have very valid thoughts on this. Is Native Americans and their place in American history. I had Michaela Bearpaw on to talk about that a little bit, and the idea that we committed this genocide against the Native American people is, again, partially true. There's the way that they have been treated and still to this day are treated is disgusting in a lot of ways. But the narrative that everything was peaceful until the white man came. I read Empire of the Summer Moon about the Comanche. And it was like, oh my God. Like, I heard a Louis C.K. bit where he was talking about, he's talking about like how white people are like aliens. And like, until we got here, it's like, it was just so peaceful. Indians would just sit around and they'd eat some berries and just sleep and have sex and just relax. And it was peaceful. And it's like, no, like the Comanche were brutal, horrible, raping and pillaging and torturing. And like, this idea that everything was super peaceful and then the white man came and ruined everything, again, seems to be not the full truth.
No, it's a simplistic way of looking at it. This is definitely not my area of expertise. And there's a lot of people doing some really good work right now, by the way, on Native American history. Megan Kate Nelson, for example, John Legg, for example, doing some cool stuff on that. And I'm really happy that is coming into the narrative now. That in the field, Native American history has really been marginalized for the longest time, and now we're seeing how the relationship between Native American communities and the United States government, and how that's been very tenuous for the longest time, and how there were genocidal practices undertaken by the United States government during the Civil War and afterwards, and of course before that too. But your point that you make is right, and this is whenever we look at groups of people, we have to remember that the folks who lived in North America, South America, before the arrival of the Europeans, were complex, sophisticated societies
Yeah.
that had a great deal of diversity, religious diversity, political diversity, ethnic diversity. And when you mix all that up, you're going to see people going to war over things. You're going to see people doing all kinds of things, and human beings, no matter where they're from, can be extraordinarily brutal. And so to suggest that, the Europeans arrived in some Edenic, garden-like setting where everybody was just like hanging around, eating berries. What is it, Louis C.K.? You can't mention his name anymore without being like,
I know.
socially ostracized. So we'll both be canceled by this time tomorrow. But at any rate, it's ahistorical, and it's almost laughable to think that humans would exist like way with all the diversity that existed. The idea that it wasn't until certain groups encountered, like Europeans encountered Native American cultures, is a singular Native American way of life is also kind of a racist way of looking at it. What you're doing is you're distilling millions of people into a singular identity.
They're all the same.
They're all the same.
Yeah,
No, of course they're not the same. We're talking about, hundreds, if not thousands of different language groups and, religions and all these different things. They're, this extraordinarily diverse group, and to distill them into, Indians, as we used to say, is absolutely silly.
Yeah. So the last specific topic that I want to talk about is the idea of, in sexism, of America being a patriarchy. We've never had a female president. Like it's just finally where Congress is getting a little bit more of a balance. You look at, CEOs and stuff like that. I think that it is a flawed and potentially dangerous way to look at how equality is set up by looking at equity, because I think there's a lot of factors. I mean, you look at like the gender pay gap, and Claudia Golden's work is I've read it, and it's pretty clear about why there is the pay gaps that there are. But when it comes to American history, what can you say about like the idea that we have been a patriarchy? Why is it that was like, what from that is true of the past, and what about it is incomplete from your opinion?
Yeah, well, again, this is one of those things that isn't exactly my area of expertise, gender studies, although there's been fantastic work in this field, and people are continuing to do fantastic work in the field of gender studies. But I can say with my limited knowledge of it that the United States is, and as is most of the world, not most of the Western world, excuse me, let me make sure I clarify there, most of the Western world, been a patriarchal societies in which men tend to exist in a particular sphere of influence, economic, religious, political, and women exist in work in a domestic sphere of influence. Okay. And that has been pretty much the case up until very, very recently. And so I think that the legacy of that is still felt in many cases. Yeah, there's a pay gap. There is. And I've read the work that you mentioned, and she discusses that women make certain choices and they go into certain areas, and sometimes those areas pay less than in other areas, or women take time off to have kids, and then they don't get the promotions and these things, and I think that that's the case. The question that I would ask, being sort of a novice in this field, the question I would ask is, why is it that they make those choices? Really, what is it about culture that suggests? I mean, is it inherent? Biological? I don't know, or is it something more insidious than that? Really, that have people sort of embraced what we consider gender conventions? And this is something that I think is a much more complicated way of looking at things. You can look at statistics all day long, and numbers are great, and I love them, but they don't tell you the whole story. So you can look at numbers and you can say, 100 women came out of college and 99 of them went into fields that were associated with, childcare, and one of them became a rocket scientist. Okay, but 99 men graduated. You get my point, right? Yeah. Okay, so why do they do that? Are women incapable of being rocket scientists? Of course not. That's absurd. But why would they? So that's the real question, and that's the hard question. right?
It's nature versus nurture. And I think that certain people on certain types of thinking or certain sides of the political aisle will say it's more societal and less or more subtle and less biological. And then other side would say it's more biological, less cultural. And they'll both have their data that they're pointing to and all that kind of stuff. But it is a little societal, cultural, and a little bit of biological. But how much is the real question. And I think that's where we should be. I agree with you. That's where we should be looking.
Yeah, we should be asking those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
And I don't want to discount, the struggles that marginalized groups have gone through in this country. And I mean, I've seen it out of my own eyes, my own family, that women didn't have the same access to things that men did, growing up where I did in the world. And so, I mean, I don't want to diminish that at all.
So in history, like what would be like an example that you think, like going back to like your particular area though of, Reconstruction times, around the Civil War era and stuff like that. Like, where do you think that like what from there do you think people point to and say like, this is clear evidence that we are, tyrannical patriarchy or something? And what can you think of like an example that you could give us that would be like, well, it's more complicated than that because of blah? Do you have anything like?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can look at the secession crisis, for example, and you can talk about complications. I mean, look at Abraham Lincoln, his positions. And he's a moderate Republican. The Republican Party at the time was in favor of free labor. The free labor movement that reserved all the federal territories to keep slavery out of that and to preserve that for free white laborers to set up farms and various other things. Okay, so the Republican position is essentially that. Within the Republican Party, of course, are a very small group of abolitionists, right? And these group of abolitionists say, no, we need to not only just reserve certain areas for free labor, but also attack slavery where it exists. Okay, so you see this sort of wide range of opinion on what to do about slavery. So you get the 1619 Project, which is very critical of Abraham Lincoln, because Abraham Lincoln, beginning of the Civil War, said very clearly that his job was to preserve the Union. And however he did that, he was going to do it, whether he could free slaves or not free slaves. And so they're critical of him, saying that, see, he's just a racist. He doesn't really care about the fortunes of the futures of people, of enslaved people. He cares about preserving the Union. So, therefore, he is a racist. Okay, well, yes, that's true. He is by our standards, and probably embraced, or absolutely embraced the sensibilities of your standard racist worldview of the 19th century, where blacks were intellectually and morally inferior. He would have embraced that, but he also abhorred the institution, right? And looked for a way to get in where he could actually put slavery on the road to extinction somehow. And this is what so terrified the slaveholding South, is that they acknowledged that, because he said all the time he wasn't going to attack slavery where it existed. And they said, but yeah, but you also said these things, slavery's, we can't exist half slave, half free. And one side wants to preserve it and the other side are going to put it on the road to extinction. And he's in the Republican Party that's, on the record as being opposed to the institution. So there you go. Even the logic suggests that Lincoln is ultimately going to do this. And I know he didn't like slavery. And so, that's a complicated question.
Right.
It's more than just a, either or kind of situation there.
Yeah. So wrapping it up, I want to get your take, kind of like, if your call to historians out there, especially history teachers and professors out there, about how do we get to the things that we've been discussing for the past hour, is like, how do we get to this place where we are truly balanced? Because I actually talked to a student today who said, I know that my teacher really, really hates Trump. So what I do is, on all of my papers that I write, I talk about how Trump is horrible, and she gives me A's. And it's like, oh my God, like that's such a teenager thing to do. Like, they're so manipulative. And I know I have students that do like the same thing for me. They're like, things are complicated because it depends on your perspective. And I'm like, oh, beautiful, A+, Yeah, like the kids know how to manipulate. But I think there is something very dangerous when we as educators at every level, from elementary school all the way up to teaching grad school and teaching college level, is to be aware of our biases and know what our blind spots are so that we can guide our students into how to think, how to be critical, how to think critically, and not what to think. So what is your kind of advice or take on that call to the educators out there who are specifically in history, or people who are interested in history but don't understand, like, how could this, how could people possibly think this way, or this is just clearly wrong, or just like, how do you guide people into opening up their minds out there for those listening?
Yeah, that's a tough question, and I'm glad you asked it. One of the things that I would advise all teachers is not to use their platform to promote a political agenda, their own political agenda. I think that doesn't do. I think it's a disservice, and I think that most teachers are aware that they're aware of that and really want to engage critical thinking. I'm very optimistic about that, about history teachers that I've met and encountered. I don't think that history teachers are trying to indoctrinate people, more or less. And not to say that you're not going to encounter some that are, but for the most part, I think that we embrace critical thinking.
I hope you're right. I hope you're right about that.
I hope I am too. I hope I am too. And that, which actually brings me to my next point. My advice to educators is be willing to admit that you can be wrong about something. And I think showing that transparency to the kids will let them understand that it's okay for them to be wrong about something too, or at least to be able to revise their position when they find you evidence. I insist that my kids be honest in class, but always support it with evidence. If they have an opinion about something, explain to me why they have that opinion. Did they watch some crappy 2-minute YouTube video and now that's the standard under which they march? Or did they actually go and think about it and do the research and look up the evidence that supports that position, and then bring it to class, and then we can have the conversation. And I also it's funny because I had a couple of kids come up to me. One was pretty conservative and one was pretty liberal, and they had been in an argument all day over what my position was. The conservative person says, "Oh, he's really liberal," and the liberal person says, "No, he's really conservative." And that's what's funny is they don't know, because I've done everything I can not to let my own personal opinions try to influence them. I mean, I'm not trying to, like you said, I'm not trying to tell them what to think. I'm trying to teach them how to think.
Yeah.
And so if I disagree with them, I welcome that almost more than people that agree with me sometimes, because we get into the better conversations. I mean, some of my favorite students, and I know I'm not supposed to play favorites with students, but I do anyway.
We do.
To be honest. Some of my favorite students are the ones that I disagree with the most.
Yeah.
And I've given them the space to be comfortable to disagree with their teacher. And I mean, in all honesty, I've been doing this for a long time now. I can make any argument, right? Yeah. But I don't want to play that game with the kids just to prove them wrong, right? I want them to be able to open up and be able to express, their thoughts, provided that they've done the work. If they do the research, then have at it, and we can have the conversation. So that's my advice. Just be open to having those conversations in a positive, in a healthy, in an opening, welcoming space, and not ostracize someone because they think differently than you or what have you. That would be my advice to teachers.
Yeah, I love it. Keith, thank you so much for doing this. Where can people, I hope that people listen to this and they go, I disagree. I want to hash this out. Where can people, and I know you would be welcoming to that, as am I, we're putting ourselves out there, because if we're wrong, if I'm wrong, if you're wrong, and someone can present you with data to change your mind, I think that you're probably like me, where you will change your mind. Oh, wow, this is you want the best ideas possible. Yep. So where can people see what you're up to? What's your Twitter handle? All that kind of stuff. You just give all the plugs so we can get people more eyes on you and what you're doing.
Sure. So I have a blog that I've been working on now for probably a little over a decade, in which I've just recently put a piece up on. It's called On Being Wrong, as a matter of fact, because I changed my mind about something when I was presented with evidence to the contrary of my original thoughts. Yeah. So there you go. You can find it at keithharrishistory.com. And on there, I host a podcast of my own where I talk with various scholars. A lot of times they're Civil War scholars, Reconstruction scholars, but I address all kinds of different fields, people who are introducing interesting new takes, new approaches to history, and the new approaches to methodology. You can find that. The name of the podcast is The Rogue Historian. You can find that at theroguehistorian.com. And my Twitter handle is M like Michael, M Keith Harris. And I've been on there since, oh my goodness, I was an early adopter. I've been on
You
there
and Ashton Kutcher.
Yeah, I was on there like at 2000. He has more followers than me, I think.
Probably.
I've been on there since like 2007. So if you dig back far enough, you'll probably see me saying something really awful.
Probably, yeah. I think we all do. I think taking anything out of context, we're all in trouble.
Yeah, we're doomed.
But cool. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I hope people listening are get a little challenged, and then it's going to do what we mentioned, which is they're going to go, let me look into that a little bit more. It's all just like, this is just meant as a nudge, essentially. So
great.
Cool. Thank you so much, sir.
You are welcome. Have a good one.
All right. Bye-bye.